Welcome everyone to the Wheeler Centre's Law and Order Week and our very interesting subject today, which is a history of bad behaviour. My name's Andrew May. I'm a social historian from the University of Melbourne, and I'm really delighted to have been asked to chair the discussion this evening, and without further ado we'll get the ball rolling. The format of the evening, I think the panel's a little bit like a perpetual motion machine, and my job's just to kind of get people rolling and then in about 45 minutes or so stop them so that we've got a little bit of time for Q&A involving the audience. We've got three speakers this evening: Jeff Sparrow, Lenny Robinson and Shane Maloney. And they'll be known to many of you, but Jeff here on my left immediately is the editor of Overland magazine, and his most recent book is Killing: Misadventures in Violence. And of course he's very well known for his two Radical Melbourne books, which he co-authored with his sister Jill. Two really marvellous compendia of sites and events connected with Melbourne's political radicals and rebels. Lenny Robinson, in the middle, is a teacher, writer and author most recently of Madame Brussels, This Moral Pandemonium, a biography of the infamous little-known identity Madame Brussels. And on the end is Shane Maloney, a columnist and of course the creator of the popular Australian crime novel series, the Murray Wheeler novels. And what I'm going to do is draw them into the discussion in turn to speak for 5 or 10 minutes on their own, and then if they stick to their time, we might have a little bit of a chance for a further discussion, and then we'll invite some questions from the floor. So, Jeff, I really love Radical Melbourne. It's a book that I constantly return to, both volumes, from the kind of riots and bombings to sort of bugger up and the police strike and so on. There's a lot of bad behaviour in it, though of course I guess bad behaviour is all relative in some ways, and that's something that we might want to come back to. But let's for starters invoke that little ripple effect that takes us back to the 1830s in Melbourne, a time when jail is spelt with a G, and when through those early years in the 1840s, in fact, offenders were often put in stocks outside the watch house in Collins Street. So I'll invite you to take the floor and tell our audience something about John Batman and John Pascoe Faulkner and the Market Square Jail.
Yes. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks all of you for coming. I hope we've escaped the threatened weather apocalypse that was due to descend. Many people here have probably read Sophie Cunningham's new book about Melbourne, and if you have, you'll be familiar with one of the anecdotes in it, where a friend of Sophie's has these cartoons, I think from the 1920s, comparing Melbourne attitudes to Sydney and Sydney attitudes to Melbourne. And in them, there's a character, John Melbourne, who is imagining John Sydney, what life in Sydney is like. So John Melbourne imagines John Sydney as carrying a surfboard and heading off to Bondi Beach. And then down below, John Sydney is imagining John Melbourne as carrying a machine gun and heading off to Fitzroy to kill someone. So this sense of Melbourne as a city of crime goes back a long way, and I wanted to sort of take it back right to the start, which gives me a chance to talk about one of my favourite places in Melbourne, which, as Andrew touched upon, is the corner of Collins Street and William Street. And this is of historical significance for many different reasons, one of which is because it was the site of the first ever medical operation in Melbourne, when a convict by the rather unfortunate name of William Bone was cured of venereal disease by having his penis amputated without anaesthetic. And there's no historical marker signifying that this event took place, but what there is a statue of Melbourne's founder, John Batman, which is kind of opposite because John Batman, of course, was famously syphilitic himself. And while history doesn't record the state of his penis, we do know that, in fact, his nose fell off at one stage. As happens to you when you have syphilis, as no doubt some of you are aware, or not. Anyway, I mention this because if you're going to talk about criminal Melbourne, you really have to start with its settlement. If anyone's read James Boyce's fantastic new book about the early history of Melbourne, he makes it very clear from the start that the settlement of Melbourne was essentially a giant illegal land grab carried out by shonky entrepreneurs. And one of those entrepreneurs is John Batman, of whom there is a statue on that Collins Street corner. John Batman, one of his neighbours in Van Diemen's Land, described him thus: a rogue, thief, cheat, liar, a murderer of blacks, and the vilest man I have ever known. And unfortunately that's not documented on his statue, but next to it is the statue of Melbourne's other great founder, John Pascoe Fawkner. And he was a criminal as well. I mean, he was literally a criminal in the sense that he was a former convict. But one of the fantastic ironies of that location is that two statues are there as if the two founders were best buddies. And of course, they weren't anything of the kind. In fact, they absolutely hated each other. Fawkner described Batman in the following terms, and this isn't on the statue either. He is devoid of intelligence, a mere bore who goes about with a short pipe in his mouth and is always drunk when he can get the liquor, and is very brutish in his address at those times. When sober, he is a specious hypocrite. Now, Fawkner, whether he was specious or not, is an open question, but he was certainly a hypocrite because one of his roles in early Melbourne was in fact to run the hotel. So he was largely responsible for selling the alcohol on which John Batman would regularly get himself plastered. But this didn't stop Fawkner from, in his diary, making these little notes. It's a fantastic document. If you ever get the chance to read it, it's absolutely hysterical because every couple of days Fawkner is recording how drunk Batman happened to be at that particular time. Here's a typical account. On my refusal to let him have more goods on credit, Batman commenced shooting my dogs and rabbits. His wife set a large bulldog on a calf of mine tied up near my house, broke its leg, and I was compelled to kill it. She, as well as her husband, frequently get drunk, and then their language and behaviour is dreadful. Besides the liquor he has had from me, he's had 20 gallons from the Adelaide and about the same from the Caledonia, a very small quantity of which he's given to the men. Master and men almost uniformly return to the settlement singing and roaring drunk. That's not on the statue either. When Batman eventually succumbed to his syphilis and alcoholism, he was buried in the Melbourne Cemetery, which, as many of you know, is now where the Victoria Market is. And one of the extraordinary things about Melbourne is one of the few cities in the world to bulldoze its oldest cemetery and put up a car park over the top of it. But such was the state of the relationship between Batman and Fawkner that after Batman's death, the rumour got about not only that he was haunting the cemetery, but he was coming out of the cemetery to haunt Fawkner. And when this idea was put to him, Fawkner responded like this: "Ho ho, take my word, Batman would not be such a fool to play me such a trick, even if he could. And if he tried it on with me, I would make it warm for the fellow." So this is their relationship, and this is why it's kind of ironic that they're immortalised next to each other. The other massive irony about that site, of course, as Andrew touched upon, is that it marks the location where the colony built its first proper jail in 1839. Now, I think Shane's going to touch on this later, but Melbourne has always had an interesting set of police. Gary Owen, the great chronicler of early Melbourne, famously described the early constabulary as mostly a miserable set of broken-down cripples. The very first police magistrate, a guy called Major St John, was nicknamed Tippo because he would regularly ask people for tips, or other words, bribes. Fawkner later complained, "He takes bribes from all conditions of men, from the half-dozen eggs or the pound of butter, up to a cow or a calf, horses, grog, wines, champagne, brandy and gin." Nonetheless, despite, or perhaps because of this police force, this miserable gang of broken-down cripples, jails were particularly important in early Melbourne for three reasons. Firstly, they were important to continue the dispossession of the original owners. One of the things that Boyce's book makes clear that because Melbourne was used for grazing cattle, within 4 years of the original settlement, the Indigenous people in the area were reduced to starvation. And so that first jail that was built in 1839, something like half of the population recorded there were Indigenous, the beginning of a very, very high rate of Indigenous incarceration that continues to the present day. The second reason why the jail was very important was to discipline the convict workforce. Early Melbourne, the roads were cleared, the buildings were constructed by a convict workforce, and on that Collins and William Street corner, every week there would be the regular lashings take place. The public floggings would take place on that corner. Thirdly, the jail was even more important to discipline the free working class, because under the Master and Servants Act of the time, you could be jailed for unsatisfactory conduct or for absconsion or for almost anything that displeased your employer. That's why the jail had a set of stocks, basically the medieval pillory, except instead of restraining your arms, it restrained both legs. Gary Owen describes it like this: there was no guard to object to the passers-by having a yarn with the unfortunates, so it often came to pass that their pals and other sympathisers would have a confab with the fellows in trouble and give them figs of tobacco, as modern philanthropists treat the monkeys to nuts at the Acclimatisation Society's garden. And some allowance was made for women. Gary Owen continues, 3 or 4 times an outrageous harridan of an abandoned woman was stocked, the concession being made in her favour that only one of her feet was shackled and she could kick away as she liked with the other. The stocks, of course, were mostly used to punish drunkenness, but of course only the drunkenness of a certain class. Let's go back to Faulkner's diary about John Batman. Here's one of the kinder things that he wrote about Mr. and Mrs. Batman. Batman and wife, not quite so drunk today. I think their grog was short. But the stocks were only for those who couldn't afford the fines. So, Batman never ended up in there. Later on, the stocks were augmented by a treadmill so that prisoners could be forced to conduct their hard labour even in the worst of weather. This was before the new prison, what we now call the Old Melbourne Jail, was constructed in Elizabeth Street. But my absolute favourite part of that Collins Street site, and I'll finish on this note, is the plaque that marks the historic significance of that site. And I think it goes some way to explain the character of John Melbourne, as we might call him. Because, to recap, we have on that site statues of 2 sleazy entrepreneurs on a location that was the historical site of the old jail, the old stocks, and the old flogging triangle. And the plaque reads, "This is your heritage, preserve it and pay homage now." Thanks.
Well, let's move our time machine forward a little bit. An odd thing starts to happen around the mid of the 19th century, and if you haven't had the opportunity, as I've had, to read through the voluminous correspondence that Melburnians send to the Melbourne City Council over the decades and years, complaining about various things, people start writing to have the names of their streets changed. In 1876, the name of Romeo Lane was changed to Crossley Street, residents claiming they were having trouble letting properties to respectable tenants, despite having replaced former dilapidated hovels with superior stabling. Blossom Alley off Little Burke Street was changed to Berkeley Place, and of course Stephen Street, one of the main streets, was changed to Exhibition Street around the time of the International Exhibition to rid the area of its disreputable associations. Not a stone's throw from here, in fact. I remember over the summer of 1987, I was a volunteer on the Little Lon archaeological dig, and I'd spent many sweltering days with a pick and a shovel digging up the car park, painstakingly removing every centimetre of cement and gravel and earth, and finding myself, physically in my imagination being transported layer by layer back to an earlier Melbourne. And of course we all waited for the kind of cry to go up from one of the trenches or another of what the latest kind of exciting find, interesting discovery that someone might have come across. And I remember my best find was Lady Godiva, who emerged from her earthy grave, I remember, by degrees. And I remember this earth-encrusted lump of something. And as I kind of, raised a spit and rubbed at it, this porcelain figurine emerged of a naked woman on a horse, and the inscription underneath. And the Diggs records later told me that this was a piece of probably 1860s Staffordshire pottery. It was found in Trench 18, close to two brothels in Cassidy Place and Surrey Place. And she was certainly the most interesting thing I found. Mostly it was just old oyster shells and bits of broken glass. But this was a tangible link of kind of material erotica that easily kind of linked back to the culture of this brothel precinct. So at this point I'm going to ask Lenny to take the podium and help us here by painting a little bit of a portrait of the sex industry in Melbourne in this period towards the end of the late 19th century, and perhaps something too of Madame Brussels, about whom she's written, and the kind of world she inhabited.
That talk about Lady Godiva makes it look like I'm going to do something far more salacious up here than I actually am. As Andrew said, I guess there wasn't only a porcelain naked lady in that precinct. It was full of naked ladies in the late 19th century. In fact, I was re-looking at some material that had been documented in the police. There was a Royal Commission into Police in 1882, and in the block bound, or the two blocks bound by Spring Street, Russell Street, Burke Street and Latrobe Street, there were 60 brothels in 1882. And they're only the ones known to police. So if you remember that at that time brothels spanned everything from places like Madame Brussels, the place I researched, which was, described as this opulent venue with marble baths and fabulous carpets and busts of naked ladies everywhere, to what were basically hovels of one room with a dirt floor and a mattress, a sack on the ground. This was probably underrepresents exactly how many brothels there were in that area. In addition, there were 7 safe houses, and in fact, this is Swanston Street, isn't it? Yeah. One was just over here, and one was just over here on Swanston Street. And what they were pubs that where the proprietors conspired with prostitutes to let them come in, solicit in the bars, and also take clients upstairs. And those kind of places were all over Melbourne. And one of the things I found really interesting is when we think of the sex industry today, it's that kind of thing that's tucked out in the streets of St Kilda or the streets of Fitzroy. But it was really open in Melbourne. It was everywhere in Melbourne. There was 600 full-time prostitutes in the city, and for many prostitutes it wasn't a full-time job. It was the kind of job you did when there was no money coming in, or when seasonal work had dried up for your husband, or if you found yourself on bad straits. But it was a very open presence on the streets. There's lots of letters of outraged citizens of Melbourne writing in about their disgust about all the street soliciting outside the hotels and outside the theatres in Burke Street. And in fact, the theatres were quite... they weren't adverse to the prostitutes coming in. In fact, the Theatre Royal, which was up the top of Burke Street, very well-known theatre, it had a special room, a special salon where men could solicit with prostitutes, which had the wonderful name of the Saddling Paddock. And there was a couple of theatres that had that kind of thing going on. So it was everywhere. It was all over the streets. Women walked up and down Collins Street, women called sly girls who didn't look like prostitutes, and solicited. Women walked up and down Swanston Street at night to pick up the crowds from the theatres in Burke Street. And there was women like Madame Brussels who ran these elite brothels up on Lonsdale Street. In fact, there was 12 brothels in a row where her brothel is, which is just between what was called Stevens, now Exhibition, and Spring. And of course there was the infamous Romeo Lane and Juliet Terrace, which wandered onto a place called Bilkington Square, which existed on no map but was known to every policeman. And it was described as a haven of thieves and prostitutes. Interestingly, there was a well-known preacher called Cowley Coles, and he used to go and stand in there and preach in the middle of it. Don't know how well it went down. But it became well known for a practice called bilking, named after it, which is where prostitutes got men who were really, really drunk, took them into the alleyways around Bilking Square, which was very difficult to get in and out of, waited till they got their pants down, then robbed them and left. And they also did it in cabs as well. So all this was going on, and it was all quite open despite particular outrage by citizens. And police pretty much turned a blind eye to it at this time. And in fact, there was a bit of outrage because police conspired a bit with the prostitutes. The Commissioner of Police, a guy called Frederick Standish, even entertained the Duke of Edinburgh in 1867 in Annie Wilson's brothel. So the police were very involved in the industry, you could say. The woman I researched, Madame Brussels, though, she didn't have... she was constantly the focus of moral evangelists, but she never got convicted. And probably the reason she never got convicted was because her clientele consisted of parliamentarians, graziers, kind of respectable members of society. Her big brothel in what is now in Lonsdale Street was funded by Sir Samuel Gillett, who was not only a Knight of the Realm but was Lord Mayor of Melbourne 3 times, and he financed 2 of her brothels. So that helped a lot. It was once said that if she ever opened her mouth, divorce papers would fly around Melbourne. So I guess it was a very different world. There's lots of stories I could tell you about Madame Brussels, and I'll just end with one that's probably my favourite. The thing that I loved about Madame Brussels when I was researching her was she had a really dichotomous personality. On one level she was brash and outrageous, and on another level there was something a bit more sentimental and human about her. But one of the brash and outrageous stories I loved is that Henry Varley, this moral evangelist who was out to get her, wrote that he'd seen her down Collins Street parading a beautiful 20-year-old girl with a white feather in her hat to tell by advertisement that she was available for her price in her gilded den, which I thought was an interesting story. But I'll leave it there.
Well, I think as we've already heard, if there's bad behaviour in town, there'll invariably be police involved in some way or another. Melbourne's very early police, who were sent down from Sydney, actually spent a lot of their time caught up in town administration, you know, inspecting abattoirs and probably arresting quite a few drunkards. They didn't have a uniform. They just had a hatband with the word Melbourne Police written on it. And one of their tasks was, in fact, there was a big problem with stray dogs, very vicious packs of dogs in Melbourne in the 1830s and 1840s. And they were ordered to go around catching the dogs, and they would be paid per tail. So they'd cut the tail off the dogs and they'd present that for their payment, and of course led to a further nuisance of all these rotting carcasses of dogs lying about the streets. The gold rush obviously had a huge impact. On one day in November 1851, 50 of the 55 Melbourne City Police resigned and went off to the goldfields. But the 1850s saw the Police Regulation Act, which amalgamated all these sort of, I think there were 7 autonomous police forces kind of operating under their own steam, amalgamated them into one, created the position of the Chief Commissioner of Police, and they got uniforms at this time too. There was a Royal Commission, which I think has already been mentioned in the 1880s, and this was a period where the force was severely criticised for a lot of things. The detective force, which dated from the 1840s, was critiqued for its very dubious information gathering efforts, its lack of accountability, subsequently led to the formation of the CIB. And the Royal Commission also concluded that much of the public immorality in Melbourne resulted directly from the corrupt and inefficient administration of the police department. So we're going to move our time frame along a bit, and I'm going to ask Shane to perhaps take us forward a little bit, even into the 20th century, through something of this history of lurid cops.
Bent Melbourne, where to begin? Where to end? When I first started writing crime novels set in Melbourne, it was widely regarded as a somewhat unpromising locale. Sirens are rarely heard still, and we have no seething ghettos in which marauding gangs conduct open warfare, although a couple of dickheads in Pascoe Vale a few weeks back really had the press wetting their pants with excitement, but a shot fired in Pascoe Vale Road I don't think exactly qualifies. In fact, it's a remarkably placid place at one end of the spectrum. There were a total of 81 murders in Victoria last year, not including members of the Moran-Williams family. 81 homicides, which for a state of 5.5 million people isn't bad, really. That's about, I think, about one. You've got about 1 in 75,000 chance of being a victim of a homicide, which are odds that I personally feel I can live with. And in fact, what we've done is we've legalised so many activities that were previously criminal that we've turned them round to an advantage, and we've made them a very positive part of marketing Melbourne. So, for example, on say on a given Saturday, you can start off at the Vic Market, buy some fruit and vegetables from a stall operated by members of the Calabrian and Drogheda. You can go down to one of our lovely urban lakes and watch people exceeding the speed limit by 150 kilometres an hour on a public road. You can have a nice Chinese meal in a triad stood-over restaurant. You can spend the afternoon playing dice, poker, baccarat. You can spend your winnings in a world-class knocking shop, having your wing-wang played with by Thai twins, and then you can go out into the street, enter a club across the road, get totally munted, fried on ice. You can glass your girlfriend, and you can do all of this without at any point ever coming into contact with the constabulary. Unless, of course, you plan to ride your bike home without wearing a helmet. And the police have been very much in our thoughts lately, quite visible, I suppose, for a whole range of reasons, whether they're activities in the street or higher up. I understand now that the next Chief Commissioner of Police will be decided by a knife fight in a dinghy. But none of these police political shenanigans are new, of course. Throughout its history, the politics of policing has kept breaking through in Melbourne and become highly visible. Since 1852, there have been at least 22 Royal Commissions, reviews and inquiries into the Victoria Police. And what fascinating reading they make. That's the one about every 8 years, which is probably about right, I think, on the balance. In 1905, we had the Cameron Royal Commission into the gambling industry, which was in those days run by ruthless, greedy bastards with the connivance of corrupt politicians, unlike today, when gambling is undertaken by public-spirited organisations who willingly contribute $4 billion a year to the state's coffers. And butter doesn't melt in anyone's mouth. The Commission in 1905 examined the role of the John Wren machine, or the ALP as it's currently known. Its recommendations were never implemented. In the early 1920s, there was an inquiry into the Combine, which was a cartel of brothel owners. Now, these guys paid off the top cops, but the benefits weren't trickling down. So the lowly cops on the beat were reduced to loitering outside knocking shops, scaring away the trade until someone came out and slung them a fiver. So naturally there had to be an inquiry into the equitable distribution of gains from the industry. In the 1920s, we also had the famous police strike. The issue on that occasion was police pensions and the introduction by the Chief Commissioner of what were called spooks, who were plainclothes detectives whose job it was to spy on the other police. In other words, the establishment of internal affairs, or the toe cutters, or whatever we call them these days. In response to this, and contrary to the Police Association, rank and file police staged a wildcat strike on the evening of the 31st of October 1923. I'd like to read you a description of this because the public in Melbourne did not fail to take full advantage of the opportunity presented to them. And when I was reading this today, I thought, well, what does this remind me of? So I suggest at this moment that just close your eyes and think of England. Scenes of mob violence were amazing and unprecedented. For some hours on Saturday, anarchy reigned in Melbourne streets. Plate glass shop windows were smashed in broad daylight and the contents brazenly taken. Jewellers and clothing shops were among the first targeted. Thousands of pounds worth of jewellery, binoculars, firearms and the most expensive clothing were ripped out uncaringly by the mob. Often the initial thieves were set upon by others in the crowd who could not get close to the window to help themselves. This invariably provoked physical violence. Bottles were a favourite weapon, with mounting injuries against bystanders. Broken bottles were a fearsome sight. Looting started at the Leviathan Clothing Company, which is like, I guess, the Adidas of its day, and spread to Commode Jewellers, Charles Jeffreys Footwear and other shops in Swanston Street between Burke and Collins. Newspapers and pockets were stuffed with stolen goods. Security screens were no match for the mob, intent on looting. Windows were often smashed with shop fittings. Shops where staff had taken out the display windows were not attacked. In others, staff cowered as the mob prowled outside. The short stretch of Swanston Street and nearby Burke Street were bedlam. Bottles, broken glass, furniture and goods littered the road. Pools of blood told their own story. There was no way that trams could get through. By 6:30 p.m. the city's hotels had closed and many of the patrons, obviously affected by alcohol, had joined the crowd. I love that. The 6 o'clock swill ends and all of these guys surge out into the street. Shortly afterwards, the dummy of a Johnston Street tram trying to pass through the intersection was derailed and attempts were made to set it alight. Subsequently, other tram officials arrived at the scene and after a fierce fight, the tram was restored to the tracks and driven away. The event seemed to be the signal for a kaleidoscope of violence which then followed. While the crowd was so occupied, a group of over 50 police led by an officer descended on them wielding batons. Scabs were brought in from the country. And the fight left many sore heads and much abandoned property. Much destruction occurred in Elizabeth Street between Burke and Flinders. Women used their skirts to carry away goods. Small boys hid cans of fruit up alleyways to return for more as they scavenged the streets. Others struck matches as they tried on boots and hats to see if they were the correct size. According to the Argus, a Bolshevist orgy prevailed. So we know who to blame. It's the same people who are doing it now. The mob soon felled an elderly man quoting from the Bible. Possibly the guy from the square. To have been there. What I particularly liked about that was also that there was a 300-strong two-up school ran for the whole weekend next to the town hall where the toilets are there on Collins Street. The Chief Commissioner resigned, of course, and eventually he was replaced by Thomas Blamey, who later became, of course, Australia's first and only Field Marshal. Blamey sorted out relations with the coppers, but then in October 1925, a raid on a Gertrude Street brothel turned up a man who identified himself by flashing Blamey's badge, number 80. When called on, so he was let off, but when called on to explain, he said he'd loaned his badge to a friend, but he couldn't tell anyone who the friend was because the friend was a family man. He was good for the coppers, but he was very bad for the unemployed and pretty well anyone else. He had police fire on striking waterside workers, killing a Gallipoli veteran. And one of his dicks shot a speaker at a free speech rally in Sydney Road in Brunswick. And if you pop up there to the Mechanics Institute, you'll see a statue out the front commemorating the whole campaign in which Shorty Patullo was shot behind the Brunswick post office. In 1936, Blamey was forced to resign after covering up the fact that covering up the details of the shooting of the head of the CIB, who used to take his girlfriends with him on jobs, on police raids. There were two unnamed female companions on that night when he was shot. But by the 1960s, the police and politicians were very comfortable, thick as thieves, you might say. The Premier was Balti, and his powerful deputy was the Chief Secretary, Arthur Ryler. Arthur liked banning things because he wanted to protect his teenage daughter from filth. And when it was pointed out to him that his daughter was in fact already married and had several children, he explained that, well, this was his hypothetical teenage daughter. Now, he didn't legislate to ban things. He simply had the Vice Squad go down and charge bookshops and theatres with obscenity, seizing copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover and actually arresting actors on stage during a production of Boys in the Band. They were arrested for using homosexual dialogue. While this was going on, Arthur Ryler's wife decided to divorce him. She was a well-regarded veterinary surgeon who operated from their house in Kew, and she was a leader of the Girl Guides. She told him she was going to commence proceedings when suddenly she was found comatose in the backyard of their Kew house, which was also her surgery. She had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, which can occur spontaneously or as the result of a head injury. We'll never know what it was because in space on the death certificate reserved for the doctor's name was a notation from the coroner ordering that her body be immediately cremated without further inquiry or further ado. Then in the 1970s came Bert Wainer and the abortion inquiry. Abortions were illegal. Homicide cops were not only taking bribes to protect doctors, a former policeman, not a doctor, was one of Melbourne's busiest abortionists, backyard abortionists. When the Beach inquiry unmasked corrupt officers and recommended prosecutions, the Police Association responded by threatening Premier Dick Hamer with a repeat of 1923. No police were convicted and the government met the police union's demands. Things, of course, have improved immeasurably since then. There was, for example, no corruption whatsoever during the Bracks-Brumby era, apart from the time that Steve Bracks got the cops to bash up Rod Quantock and paid them with sausages. Victoria didn't need an independent commission against corruption, said John Brumby, because we don't have any corruption. His logic was impeccable. Instead of corruption in Victoria, we have integrity. We've got integrity commissions coming out our police badges. And do I have enough time? Just very, very briefly. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read something again. This is from the Office of Police Integrity's report on the Victorian Armed Offenders Squad. So this is quite old. This is 2008. So you just put, that's a really long time ago in police time. So and a lot of practices have changed since then. But this is straight from the report. of the Armed Offenders Squad, formerly the Armed Robbery Squad. At around 6 p.m, 2 members of the squad, Officer 1 and Officer 2, are seen assaulting a suspect in an interview room at St Kilda Road complex shortly after he's been lodged there. This is the video evidence. At 6:05 p.m, a purported welfare check occurs when an unidentified officer introduces the squad inspector to the suspect. The inspector can be heard saying, "It's going to be a long, hard day for you, pal. It's going to be a long, hard day for you, all right? I suggest you listen to some of the advice the boys are going to give you. It might be a lot less painful, a lot easier for you, all right?" I don't know who writes these scripts, but honestly, they wouldn't get past the first level of selection in commercial television. At about 6:17 p.m, the suspect is dragged from his chair, this is 15 minutes later, and assaulted by 2 members of the squad. During the assault, Officer 1 told the suspect to, quote, "Show us some fucking respect here," unquote. Between slapping and punching the suspect, he says the words, "fucking armed robbery squad." At 6:21 p.m, shortly after the assault recorded above, an unidentified police officer enters the interview room and throws a box of tissues on the table and says words to the effect of, "Don't bleed everywhere." At 6:50 p.m, in the presence of Officer 2, Officer 1 again assaults the suspect by slapping him to the left side of his face numerous times with his right hand. As he was assaulting the suspect, Officer 1 says words to the effect of, "That ear's coming off by the end of the day." At around 8 p.m, a third officer, Officer 3, in the presence of Officer 2, assaults the suspect before commencing to tape a formal record of interview. Officer 2 can be seen launching himself over the desk to attack the suspect while Officer 2 has him on the ground, apparently punching him. Officer 3 walks around to them and kicks the suspect a number of times while he's on the ground being assaulted by Officer 2. The suspect can be heard asking for a Melways so that he can show them where a gun the police are searching for. Soon after, a Melways is thrown at him. Melbourne's like that, isn't it? You really don't know where you are without a Melways.
Well, we've got some extraordinary visual images of bad behaviour, and it would be a crime, given the time, not to take some questions from the floor. But I'll just kick the panel off with another mental image of mine that comes to mind. In 1898, the body of a young woman was found in a box floating down the Yarra River, and she was unidentified. And so what the police decided to do was to exhibit the dead body at the Melbourne morgue. And people sort of trickled by. It was an attempt to identify the body. But as the weeks went by and they actually removed the head from the torso and just had the head on display, 8,000 Melburnians went through to have a bit of a squiz, which is a little bit more than just people who might think they know who she is. So it intrigues me, and it intrigues me in measuring, how things have changed and the distance between ourselves and some of these characters we've been talking about. And there's that kind of voyeurism we have. So I guess throwing open to the panel, are we that different to the Melburnians of a little over a century ago? Why do we like writing? Why do you like writing about these things? And what explains our appetite for crime?
Well, I don't know. I mean, when you were saying that, I was just thinking of the day that the Occupy Melbourne protest was being dispersed, that every newspaper had close-up photos of Gaddafi, not only, as we know now, being executed, but being tortured and being raped. And this was on every newspaper and on every TV station, and this is being hailed as a great triumph of democracy. It doesn't seem to me to be terribly terribly different. I don't know. It does seem to me that in some ways I think the culture has changed over the last 10 to 15 years, and I think the war on terror has had a lot to do with that. When I was a kid, I don't think there would have been the same kind of ghoulish fascination with watching people die on television that there is now.
There's certainly been a long-term fascination, though, with looking at the dark side. I remember during my research reading how in the 1880s people would come down from the country and they'd tour the slums. They'd go on to see the seedy side of Melbourne and to look at the poverty and in a way that respectable Melburnians in some ways were quite proud of their slums because it made them a metropolis. But it's interesting how people wanted to look at that. They wanted to go and see those parts and treated them as a tourist site.
Yeah, I think our interest in the criminal justice sort of system is a fairly natural one. Apart from any vicarious enjoyment we might get from scenes of sort of lurid gangland activity, which is very often hilarious. The death of Tuppence is Moran. Surely this comedy of errors is partly what draws us to it. But I think one of the reasons people enjoy crime fiction is that it simultaneously moves away the kind of real threat, because there's a sense of resolution occurs at the end of any piece of crime fiction. Eventually you're given a solution. But at the same time, through the working out of the mechanics of the plot, you learn something about the peculiarities of a particular society. Every country, every place handles these matters in a different way, and in doing so it reveals some of the mainsprings of where real power resides, because effectively there's nothing more powerful than being able to determine whether or not someone is held accountable or made to pay for killing someone else. Despite all of the kind of the jokes about this, who'd want to do a copper's job? And so at the same time, that for all of us, I think there is this sense of the police, if unconstrained, can be terribly threatening. On the other hand, who are you going to call if something happens? And certainly if you suffered an act of violence or had your life taken from you, you'd want appropriate, proper responses to be made to it.
Well, they did identify the body in the box. It was a 17-year-old girl called Mabel Ambrose who died after an illegal backyard abortion. But how many people here put your hand up if you'd go down and look at the head if it was on display? I don't know that many of us would, but we sort of I guess that's your point, Jeff. We sort of internalise a lot of these.
There was someone
things.
down there.
Okay.
So we've got one out the back if you...
Okay, let's throw it open. Anyone can...
Seen one severed head, you've seen them all, I reckon.
Yes, kind of taking off from Jeff's comment about Occupy Melbourne. In terms of behaviour in the present day, who's behaving badly here? The protesters, the police, perhaps the media for the way they're presenting it, or perhaps all three? I'll start out with Jeff, and perhaps the other panelists can join in answering that.
Well, I think that the Occupy movement around the world is one of the few bright seeds of hope that we have in it. It's tremendously bleak prospect that seems to be kind of opening up for us. Anyone who's following the news from Europe, I think there are grim times ahead for people, and the fact that there are some people who are daring to suggest that the world could be different from the way it is now, and maybe even slightly better, seems to me tremendously. I thought that Doyle's response to that to the Occupy Melbourne protest was absolutely extraordinary. I don't know if anyone saw the opinion piece that he wrote for the Herald Sun after the thing had been dispersed, where he declared that that the dispersal and the extraordinary police presence was necessary because the protesters were professionals and they had a stockpile of knives and forks and gas bottles and tent pegs and all the other things you'd have if you're fucking in a fucking tent. So yeah, I mean, I thought that was absolutely extraordinary, and I have never seen such an excessive police presence to a demonstration as of the week of that protest.
Well, two things struck me about the Occupy. One was the scale of the police response, and I think that possibly was not revealed to us the extent to which the Overtime Act of 2009 was applied in this particular instance, with the horse riding allowance and the special truncheon depreciation allowance and so on, because certainly there were a lot of them there. The other thing that struck me was the selectivity of this, because there are a group of people in Melbourne not very far from that spot, not very far from here, who have in fact been occupying part of East Melbourne for a very long time now, who have not been moved on. And they're a group that have been proven to contain psychopathic and dangerous elements. And that group of people stand outside the fertility control clinic and abuse and humiliate women going for an abortion, both on the way in and on the way out. And one of them even killed a security guard. Yet they're allowed to conduct their activity without a police response year in, year out. And I just wonder whether Mr. Doyle is and those responsible for the decision are somehow demonstrating their priorities in this.
I think it raises the issue too of more broadly of kind of public space and these historical changes in thresholds of, you know, who's respectable, who isn't, who's criminal, in different places of the city, in different times of the day. Loiterers hanging out, leaning up against veranda posts in the 1870s suddenly become a nuisance because they're kind of hanging around, and the City Council, brings in a law about spitting. No expectorating on the footpaths of Melbourne as a way of social control, of moving groups of people away. And these things operate in little micro sort of moral geographies as well as in bigger ways, don't they?
I used to love how when you get to, I don't know if it's still there, but the old Spencer Street station, when you come off the train from the country, the first thing you'd see on the platform would be those signs saying, "Do not spit." And I always kind of thought, what impression did this give to people coming to Melbourne for the first time? It was this city where we were uncontrollably spitting at each other the entire time.
Down the front here.
Can we really expect the wealthy to give up their position of power? Surely there's a very big threatening thing going on. So those who are behest and looked after by the wealthy are certainly going to react in the way that we've seen.
Yes.
Just to amplify that slightly, it's recently been revealed that the New York police are in fact on contract to a number of the banks, just as not as individuals who are simply employed as security guards and so on in their private time. But the New York police itself is actually has signed up to contracts to protect the specific interests of certain of the banks in exchange for payment.
Oh, yep, I've got one in the back, yep.
I was just wondering if we're not being egocentric, thinking we're incredibly criminal, have people done, similar things with, Sydney or Brisbane or elsewhere? You know what I mean?
I know with Sydney, one of the big differences between the sex industry in the 19th, early 20th century between Sydney and Melbourne is the Sydney sex industry was controlled by an underworld. So in some respects, Sydney is far worse than us in that sense at that time. Most of it was controlled in Melbourne. It was controlled by people like Samuel Gillett, but also people like furniture merchants, real estate, people in real estate.
You mean respectable people?
Respectable. Respectable people, yeah. So it wasn't a criminal underworld controlling the sex industry.
And 20 years ago, it was more or less, taken for granted that Sydney was the crime capital. They had Mr. Big, Mr. Sin. These were public officials who were these were people who were photographed next to the Premier at the races. Colourful racing identities. All of the heroin trade was being conducted out of Darlinghurst Police Station. You had Butte cops like Chook Fowler, exchanging brown paper bags full of cash. And, I think we in Melbourne can be quite proud that we've now, taken that crown from Sydney to a very great extent. And, say what you like about Jeff Kennett, I think that he did bring a sense of palpable dread to the streets of Melbourne, and that's stayed here.
Now, we've perhaps got time for one more question. Yeah, down the front.
Look, I'm relatively new to Melbourne. I'm a bit alarmed at the degree of cynicism about Victoria Police. Is it as bad as you portray? I hope you're joking.
Well, I think Shane should...
I won't have a word said against them. No, honestly, it is the finest police force that money can buy.
Until we wait for the next Royal Commission. Okay, well, we've been asked to keep to fairly strict time, so I'd like to thank our panellists, Shane, Lenny and Jeff. It's been a terrific discussion, and as usual, raises many more questions than it answers. So as you set off into this slightly dangerous city of Melbourne, be careful, and we should caution you to try and be good, and if that's not possible, don't be too bad. But let's thank our panellists.